Hi, my name is Juana Gallegos, and today I'm going to be talking about Chapter 12 and Chapter 15. First, I'm going to start off with Chapter 12, and it's about students with autism. This chapter really stood out for me because I work as an instructional assistant in a special education class with students with autism mainly, and other impairments, but mainly there are students with autism in a mild-moderate class. And when I started working in this class, I had no idea about what was autism. And within my years of experiences, I started to learn more of how they react, but I still hadn't really understood what was autism spectrum disorder. And this chapter really helps to pinpoint key aspects about this disorder. And within this chapter, it takes an emphasis that the autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability that is categorized by persistent impairments in social interactions and communication. Basically, within the autism disorder, there are domains. There are two specifically that consist of social communication impairments and restrictive repetitive behaviors and interests. Within these social communication impairments, these students have a struggle with social emotional reciprocity, and they also have a struggle with the verbal and nonverbal communication, and they also struggle with maintaining relationships. Within their behavior, they are very repetitive, so they also consist of having repetitive speech and repetitive interest. They also have an excess of reliance on routines, and they're have very fixated interests. And they also have a limited reaction or excessive reaction to a sensory input. And as I mentioned, I do work with students with autism, and within my experiences, their behaviors can be very delicate, I should say, because it is, as an instructional assistant and as special education teachers, we must have an understanding of how to use positive behavior supports to prevent such escalation of behaviors, because when a student does escalate, they are capable of doing self-injury, having aggression, tantrums, and also even doing property destruction. So there are various types of supports for these students. One is called Applied Behavior Analysis, also known as ABA, where it helps improve the student's behavior. And this research-based strategy is used with using positive reinforcements to help them develop social skills, academic skills, and also skills in their lives within like hygiene, dressing up, etc. Within schools, there are also positive behavior supports within using visuals, understanding the student. More importantly, I think getting to know what triggers them, what triggers their behavior, what are their interests. Those are very important key aspects to help a student with autism. And more importantly, having patience and an understanding of why they're behaving that way, other than stereotyping their behavior as being tantrum or being how do you say it? Not behaving appropriately, I should say, because sometimes these students are being categorized as students that are misbehaving, and they usually get punished, as in getting suspended or not fully and this will cause the student to get these behaviors as well. So, but then understanding the causes, biologically, there's no pinpoint cause, but within the genetics, they have found that if, for example, parents have one child with autism, most likely their second child will also have a high chance of having autism. Within the environmental causes, they have maybe I should say, because there's no pinpoint cause yet, that toxic exposure to chemicals and radiation. And there also is, I should say, like a myth that child immunizations have been a cause, but there's no actual credible evidence. So within understanding the causes of autism is still very vague and not fully understood. And like I said, within this chapter, I really related this to my job and my personal experiences on the importance of positive behavior supports, and that they should be research-based strategies, and that they should also use social stories to help the student understand their life with these stories and to make an understanding of the event, and to make appropriate choices for their behavior. And more importantly, to help the student actually understand and confront their disorder is by making these students more student-directed learning. So by doing self-monitoring, by encouraging self-scheduling, as in making their own calendar and making them list their calendar of events, and also by them doing their self-monitoring on their own behavior, will improve the student to have more independent skills and to control their behavior and be more part of society. So, within this chapter, I will be moving on to chapter 15 about students with hearing impairments, which I also was very intrigued to learn because not only, like I said, we have students with autism, but there are other students that have other conditions, and these would be I had a student that had a hearing loss, hearing impairment. So I think as teachers and paraprofessionals, it's so important to learn about this. Hearing loss can be described depending on the degree or severity of hearing loss. So what do I mean by the type of hearing loss? Well, there are two listed in the chapter, and it consists of conductive, which means that the hearing loss was affected by the outer ear portion and the middle ear. And then this type of hearing loss is temporary, or it can be permanent, and that can be once a hearing loss is permanent, it is more difficult to be corrected or be resolved. But then within the other type of hearing loss, there's sensorineural, where it affects the inner ear, and that's where it's more affected and cannot be corrected. But then understanding the type of hearing losses, there's also devices that can be given for students. So one device is called the bone-anchored hearing aids, and this is basically for those students that have a conductive hearing loss, and it helps students by placing a procedure where they help put the bone-anchored a device in their ears, outside of their ears, I should say, and it's more like a headband, and it's basically like a microphone that picks up sound. And then the other one is cochlear implants, where it's about affected the sensorineural hearing loss, and this is when it affects the external and internal components. And this is basically when I say external and internal components, it's a procedure where they do a surgical procedure where they internally place the device and then externally place the other device, sort of like a magnet that connects and makes the cochlear implant stay in place. And that's also where it helps the student pick up the sounds of speech and etc. And in my experiences, I worked with once a student that had a bone-anchored hearing aid. And then it was very interesting for me because I never seen that before in a student. And I was also very intimidated to work with the student because we as paraprofessionals had to help the student make sure that they had it on, because unfortunately the parent weren't really helpful, or sometimes the student would come to school without it. So as a paraprofessional, I really had to learn in that moment how to help the student. And I think from there, that's where I really was impacted in how we should, as paraprofessionals and as teachers, actually understand these type of devices to help a student if needed. With the student specifically, when they had this device, they did not speak, and that was actually very confusing for us because she was able to speak, but with that device we never knew if she was really listening because we didn't know if it was placed appropriately. So stuff like that really impacts a paraprofessional and teachers, and I think it's really important for us to understand how these devices work and how to make sure that we can also help these students at school. And from this is I believe that there's a lot of lack of professional training to assist these students. So I think we should advocate more for these students in the future and even now presently to understand these type of devices and how to help them. And most importantly, what causes these type of hearing loss is that's a very important part to understand. And in the chapter, it talks about congenital hearing loss, where it's sometimes these students are present at birth. They have these hearing loss at birth. Others are acquired hearing loss, where it's after birth. So sometimes this could be caused by an ear infection or recurrent ear infection, by a injury, etc. And the other one is called otitis media, where it's when a fluid is built up in the middle ear, and that could really cause a lot of causes and a type of hearing loss for the student. And basically what in this chapter, the metacognition is to understand the importance of the different communication methods to also give the students. So if the student is facing hearing loss, to also provide other methods of communication. One good example would be using American Sign Language. And within the American Sign Language, if to provide educational interpreters in the classroom if needed. But most importantly, I think as teachers and paraprofessionals, it is also very important for us to understand ASL at some point. And also that teachers and paraprofessionals should have the understanding, like I said, about the students' hearing loss, the type of hearing loss, and the type of hearing devices in order to help them be part of the class and be more engaged and be more in with other students as well. So overall, that's all I have for today, and thank you so much for listening.